The morning sun glints across the fjord waters, illuminating a Norse longship as it cuts through the waves. Barrels and wooden containers line its center, packed with provisions for a journey that might last weeks or even months. Within these humble vessels lies one of the most crucial technologies of the Viking Age, the sophisticated methods of food preservation that made their legendary voyages possible. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The year is approximately 850 CE. As dawn breaks over the Norwegian coast, a crew of weathered sailors prepares for a journey across the North Atlantic. Among their most pressing concerns is not the treacherous waves or potential enemies, but a more fundamental challenge: how to keep themselves fed during weeks at sea without their food spoiling. This question of preservation stood between success and starvation for the Norsemen who would come to be known as Vikings. Long before the modern convenience of refrigeration, these northern seafarers developed remarkably effective techniques to extend the life of their precious provisions. Their methods were not merely practical solutions, but represented a sophisticated understanding of their environment and the natural processes of decay. The Norse approach to food preservation was the invisible technology that made their age of exploration possible. The world before the Vikings' westward expansion was one of isolated communities, where knowledge of distant shores came primarily through tales and legends. In the harsh northern climate of Scandinavia, where winters were long and growing seasons short, survival itself depended on the ability to store food through the barren months. This necessity became the mother of invention, driving the Norse to perfect preservation methods that would eventually support their ambitious maritime ventures. The fundamental challenge faced by these seafarers was universal: food spoils, meat rots, fish decays, and bread molds. These natural processes occur as microorganisms break down organic matter, a scientific understanding the Vikings lacked, yet they empirically recognized the conditions that accelerated or slowed these changes. Their solution was to create environments hostile to this decay through methods still recognized today: removing moisture, increasing salt content, changing the acidity, or introducing smoke compounds. Life in the Norse settlements of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden was deeply connected to the seasonal rhythms of harvesting, hunting, and preparation for the lean times. When the autumn winds began to blow across the northern lands, every household turned to the critical task of preserving their food stores. These domestic techniques would later be adapted for the particular demands of sea voyages. At the heart of Viking food preservation was perhaps their most essential method: drying. The cold, dry air of the Scandinavian winter provided perfect natural conditions for removing moisture from food, inhibiting bacterial growth. Fish, particularly cod, was hung on wooden racks called skjell in Norway, exposed to the wind and sun until they became hard as wood. This technique produced stockfish, a protein-rich food that could last for years without spoiling, becoming one of the most important trade goods of the Viking world. Archaeological findings at Viking settlements have revealed the remains of these drying racks, along with storage buildings specifically designed with good airflow to facilitate the drying process. The historian Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, noted the importance of dried fish to the northern peoples, describing how it formed a staple of their diet and economy. Salt was equally crucial to Viking preservation methods, though it was a more precious commodity in northern Europe. The process of creating salt was labor-intensive, typically involving boiling seawater until only the crystalline salt remained. The sagas tell us that specialized salt-making sites existed along the coastlines, where seawater was slowly evaporated in large iron pans over fires. This valuable substance was then used to preserve meat and fish through a process we now call curing. The archaeological record has yielded evidence of these salt production areas, particularly along the southern Scandinavian coast. Analysis of pottery found at Viking sites sometimes reveals residues consistent with salt production or salt storage, underscoring its importance in their society. Salt was so valuable that it became a form of currency in some regions, giving rise to the later practice of paying workers a salary, a word derived from the Latin for salt. For long voyages, Vikings would prepare salt meat by cutting beef, mutton, or pork into workable pieces, thoroughly rubbing them with salt, and then packing them in more salt within wooden barrels. The salt would draw out moisture and create an environment too hostile for most bacteria. Similarly, fish would be gutted, split open, and packed in layers of salt. Evidence for these practices comes not only from the sagas, but from the remains of storage vessels found in shipwrecks and settlements. The Gokstad ship burial discovered in Norway contained remains of provisions that had been prepared for a journey, giving archaeologists insights into how food was packed and stored for sea travel. While the organic materials had largely decomposed, the containers and some residues remained, providing valuable clues about Viking preservation methods. Smoking was another preservation technique mastered by Norse communities. Meat or fish would be hung in special smokehouses, where a controlled fire produced smoke that would permeate the food. The smoke contained chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth while imparting flavor. This process was often combined with drying, creating a product that could remain edible for many months. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of Viking smokehouses, typically identified by their fire pits and evidence of soot accumulation on the interior walls. These structures were usually separate from main dwellings to reduce fire risk and manage the intense smoke production. The smoking process required careful attention. Too much heat would cook rather than preserve the food, while insufficient smoke would fail to protect against spoilage. According to accounts in the Icelandic sagas, particularly Egil's saga and the saga of Eric the Red, smoked meat was a valued provision for sea journeys. These texts describe the careful preparation of supplies before voyages to unknown lands, highlighting the importance these preserved foods held for exploration. Fermentation represented perhaps the most sophisticated preservation method in the Viking repertoire. While the chemistry was unknown to them, Norse people discovered that allowing certain foods to ferment under controlled conditions produced edible, long-lasting provisions. The most famous example is surströmming, fermented Baltic herring, which remains a cultural dish in Sweden today, though its powerful aroma makes it an acquired taste. The fermentation process typically involved placing fish or meat in wooden barrels with just enough salt to slow decay without stopping it entirely. Bacteria would transform the food through fermentation rather than putrefaction, creating highly acidic conditions that prevented harmful bacteria from growing. The resulting product was rich in nutrients and could last for months at sea. Archaeological evidence for fermentation comes from analysis of residues found in Viking Age containers and from the continued cultural traditions in Scandinavia. The practice required considerable knowledge and skill, passed down through generations of Norse families. Miscalculation could result in truly spoiled food rather than the controlled fermentation desired. The sagas mention sour foods that sustained travelers on long journeys, likely referring to these fermented provisions. References in the Saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red's saga suggest that fermented dairy products were also important for sea voyages, providing crucial nutrition in a compact, preserved form. For dairy preservation, Vikings employed multiple strategies. Milk was often processed into skyr, a yogurt-like product that naturally preserved the nutritional value through beneficial bacterial action. The whey byproduct from cheesemaking could be used to pickle other foods, with its acidity providing preservation properties. Butter was worked to remove all moisture, and then stored in wooden containers, sometimes submerged in brine for additional preservation. Archaeological excavations have yielded butter preserved in peat bogs, likely stored there intentionally for preservation and hidden during troubled times. Analysis of these ancient dairy products reveals the sophisticated understanding the Norse had of food transformation and storage. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River, wrote about their use of preserved dairy foods, noting the importance these items held in their diet. Berries and fruits presented their own preservation challenges. Vikings would dry these seasonal foods when abundant, creating compact sources of vitamins that could prevent scurvy during long sea journeys. Crowberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries were particularly valued for their keeping properties. Some berries were preserved in honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, though honey was a luxury item rather than a common preservative. Plant foods were generally dried for preservation. Grains were dried thoroughly before storage and often processed into flatbreads that would keep for extended periods. Peas and beans were dried and stored for winter use or sea voyages, providing essential protein and carbohydrates. Wild herbs were dried and used both for flavoring and for their medicinal properties during journeys. The Oseberg ship burial, one of the most well-preserved Viking archaeological finds, contained remnants of wild apples and kitchen implements used for food preparation, giving insights into how these plant foods might have been processed for storage and consumption during voyages. The success of these various preservation techniques enabled the Vikings to undertake increasingly ambitious journeys. As their longships ventured across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, the provisioning of these vessels became increasingly sophisticated. Food was not merely packed, but strategically selected and prepared for maximum longevity and nutritional value. The Norse settlement of Iceland around 870 CE represents a remarkable test case for their preservation methods. The initial voyages required sufficient provisions not only for the journey itself, but for surviving until the first harvests could be gathered in the new land. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, describes how the early settlers brought preserved meats, fish, and dairy products to sustain them through the initial period of settlement. Archaeological excavations at early Icelandic settlements have revealed storage structures specifically designed for preserved foods, underlining their importance to survival. Analysis of middens, refuse heaps, from these settlements shows a heavy reliance on preserved fish and meat during the initial phases of colonization. When the Vikings reached Greenland by the end of the 10th century, they faced even greater challenges. The shorter growing season and harsher climate meant an even heavier reliance on preserved foods. The Norse Greenlanders developed specialized storage solutions, including underground chambers that took advantage of the permafrost to keep foods naturally chilled, an early form of refrigeration. Excavations at Norse Greenland settlements have revealed large numbers of storage pits and specialized buildings for food processing and preservation. The remains of large numbers of seal bones suggest that seal meat was an important resource, likely preserved through drying, smoking, or salting for winter use. The saga accounts of voyages to Vinland, now recognized as North America, describe how Leif Erikson and other explorers provisioned their ships for journeys into completely unknown territories. These provisions would have included the full range of preservation techniques: dried fish and meat, salt-cured foods, smoked products, fermented items, and dried fruits and grains. The archaeological site at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America, has yielded evidence of food processing activities, including butchery waste, suggesting the preparation of meat for preservation. The short-lived nature of this settlement may have been partly due to challenges in food preservation and supply in an unfamiliar environment. Practical experience and knowledge about food preservation was passed down through generations of Norse seafarers. The preservation techniques evolved through trial and error, with successful methods becoming part of the cultural knowledge. The sagas sometimes mention individuals known for their skill in food preparation and preservation, indicating that this knowledge was valued and specialized. The containers used for food storage on Viking ships were themselves technological innovations. Wooden barrels were constructed with precision, designed to be watertight and stackable in the limited space of a longship. Archaeological finds from shipwrecks reveal barrels with different designs for different contents, some with drainage plugs for liquids, others sealed tightly for dry goods. Soapstone vessels were used for cooking and short-term storage, valued for their heat retention and durability. Pottery containers have been found with specialized lids designed to create seals for preserved foods. Even textile technology played a role, with specially woven cloths used to wrap certain foods for preservation. The Viking approach to preservation extended beyond food to drinking water, another critical resource for sea voyages. Fresh water was carried in wooden barrels, sometimes treated with herbs that had mild antibacterial properties. Beer and mead, with their alcohol content providing some preservation benefit, were also important voyage provisions, stored in specialized containers. As the Viking Age progressed, trade networks expanded, bringing new preservation techniques and ingredients to the Norse world. Byzantine preservation methods using honey and vinegar reached Scandinavia through trading contacts. Arab preservation techniques using sugar and dried fruits influenced some Viking communities connected to eastern trade routes along Russian rivers. The adaptation and evolution of these preservation technologies reflected the pragmatic nature of Norse culture. Useful techniques were readily adopted regardless of their origin. This practical approach to knowledge acquisition characterized much of Viking technological development. The effectiveness of Viking food preservation methods can be measured by the extraordinary voyages they enabled. The settlement of Iceland required a journey of over 600 nautical miles across open ocean. Reaching Greenland meant traveling nearly 1,500 nautical miles. The subsequent voyages to North America pushed even further into unknown waters. None of these journeys would have been possible without reliable food preservation techniques. These preservation methods did more than enable exploration. They became the foundation of a trading economy. Stockfish produced in northern Norway became a valuable export commodity, traded throughout Europe and providing wealth that fueled further Viking expansion. Preserved butter and cheese from Norse settlements found markets in distant trading ports, their durability making them valuable trade goods. The Arab merchant Ibn Rusta, writing in the early 10th century, described the Norse traders he encountered and noted their trade in preserved fish and meat, indicating that these products had commercial value beyond Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence from trading centers like Hedeby and Birka includes specialized storage facilities for preserved foods intended for trade rather than local consumption. As the Viking Age progressed toward its conclusion in the 11th century, their preservation techniques had become sophisticated systems reflecting generations of accumulated knowledge. These methods remained largely unchanged in Scandinavian culture for centuries afterward, forming part of the traditional foodways that defined Nordic cuisine. The effectiveness of these ancient preservation techniques has been validated by modern science. Recent microbiological studies of traditional Nordic preserved foods have confirmed that methods like air drying, smoking, and fermentation do indeed create environments hostile to harmful bacteria while often promoting beneficial microorganisms. The empirical knowledge developed by the Vikings through practical experience has proven to be scientifically sound. The legacy of Viking food preservation extends into our modern world in surprising ways. The basic principles they employed, controlling moisture, salt levels, acidity, and introducing antimicrobial smoke compounds, remain the foundation of food preservation today, though now understood through the lens of microbiology and chemistry. Traditional foods in modern Scandinavia still reflect these ancient preservation methods. Gravlax, salmon cured with salt, sugar, and dill, descends directly from Viking preservation techniques. Lutefisk, made from dried cod treated with lye, represents another continuation of Norse food traditions. These cultural foods maintain a connection to the practical necessities that shaped Viking Age cuisine beyond Scandinavia. The influence of Viking preservation methods spread through their settlements and trading contacts. The traditional salt cod industries of the North Atlantic, from Iceland to Newfoundland, owe much to Norse influences. Smoking techniques used throughout Northern Europe show the hallmarks of Viking-era technology. Even the basic techniques of fermentation, used in many European food traditions, share commonalities with Norse methods. The Viking approach to food preservation reveals a culture of ingenuity and practical problem-solving. Their success in crossing the North Atlantic and establishing settlements in distant lands testifies to the effectiveness of their methods. What they lacked in scientific understanding, they made up for in careful observation and generational knowledge. As our understanding of the Viking Age continues to evolve through new archaeological discoveries and historical research, the importance of these preservation technologies in enabling Norse expansion becomes increasingly clear. The Vikings' legacy is often framed in terms of exploration, warfare, and trade, but underlying all these achievements was the humble yet essential technology of food preservation, the innovation that made their journeys possible. Their ships may have been technological marvels, their navigational skills impressive, and their courage undeniable, but without the ability to keep food edible for weeks at sea, none of their famous voyages could have succeeded. In the story of human exploration and migration, food preservation stands as one of the most crucial technologies, rarely celebrated, but absolutely essential. The next time you reach for dried, smoked, or pickled food, you're connecting with preservation methods refined over 1,000 years ago by Norse seafarers preparing for journeys into the unknown. Their legacy lives on not just in sagas and archaeological remains, but in the fundamental ways we approach food preservation even in our modern world of refrigeration and global supply chains. When we look at the vast distances covered by Viking explorers from their Scandinavian homelands to distant shores across treacherous seas, we must appreciate the invisible technology that made it all possible. Not the dramatic clash of weapons or the graceful lines of their ships, but the quiet knowledge of how to keep food nourishing and safe through long weeks at sea. In this most practical of innovations, we find perhaps the greatest testament to Viking ingenuity and their lasting impact on human history.